Let's go back in time together and learn something new. Chapter 1: Early Life and Education. Martin Luther King Jr., born as Michael King Jr., was introduced to the world on January 15, 1929, into the heart of the segregated South, in Atlanta, Georgia. His parents were Reverend Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King, both of whom held prominent roles in the African American community in Atlanta. Martin Luther King Sr. was a well-respected pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and his mother, Alberta, was an accomplished organist and choir leader there. King was the middle child, nestled between an older sister, Willie Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel. In 1934, his father embarked on a transformative journey to Germany, attending the Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin. It was during this trip that he was profoundly influenced by the life and teachings of Martin Luther, the instigator of the Protestant Reformation. He was so inspired by Luther's bravery and conviction that, upon returning to the United States, he changed his and his son's name to Martin Luther in honor of the religious reformer. Growing up in Atlanta, King was ensconced in a richly religious community that emphasized the power of oratory, the importance of community service, and the moral responsibility to stand against injustice. These themes were constant in his family life, shaping the young King's emerging worldview. He excelled academically, skipping both 9th and 12th grades, and entered Morehouse College in Atlanta at the tender age of 15. At Morehouse, King studied sociology under the tutelage of the college's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, an influential theologian and outspoken advocate for racial equality. Mays's mentorship had a profound impact on King, and he graduated in 1948 with a BA in sociology. Driven by his growing interest in theology and inspired by the example of his father and grandfather, both influential pastors, King decided to enter the ministry. From Morehouse, King moved north to Chester, Pennsylvania, to attend the predominantly white Crozer Theological Seminary. It was during his time at Crozer, from 1948 to 1951, that he began to delve deeply into the philosophy of nonviolent resistance. He studied the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and was moved by the potential of nonviolent protest to effect social and political change. King graduated from Crozer with a Bachelor of Divinity degree, having been elected class president and awarded the Pearl Plafker Award for Most Outstanding Student. King's intellectual journey continued at Boston University, where he pursued a doctoral degree in systematic theology from 1951 to 1955. Here he further honed his philosophical and theological beliefs. His dissertation, titled A Comparison of the Conceptions of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman, allowed him to explore and critique various theological perspectives. His time in Boston was also significant for another important reason. It was there that he met his future wife, Coretta Scott. Thus, King's early life and education were characterized by an ever-deepening understanding of theology and philosophy, particularly around issues of social justice and nonviolence. It was during these formative years that the groundwork was laid for the beliefs that would shape his leadership of the civil rights movement. His deep-rooted faith, commitment to nonviolent protest, and burning desire to end racial segregation were all forged during this time. Chapter 2: Montgomery Bus Boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott, a pivotal moment in the American civil rights movement, was Martin Luther King Jr.'s initiation into leadership and a crucible for his philosophy of nonviolent protest. The year was 1955, and the issue at hand was the stark racial segregation in the public bus system of Montgomery, Alabama. It began with an act of civil disobedience by Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress, and member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat to a white passenger on a crowded city bus and moved to the rear of the bus, as required by Montgomery City Ordinance. Her arrest for this act of defiance sparked outrage within the black community and catalyzed a call for a boycott of the city's bus system. Martin Luther King Jr., then a 26-year-old pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, was thrust into the spotlight when he was elected president of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, created to oversee the boycott. Although relatively new to Montgomery and the youngest minister in the meeting, King's impressive oratorical skills and his ability to inspire with a message of peaceful protest in the face of aggression made him the unanimous choice. King rallied the African American community with his powerful speeches, encouraging them to join the boycott and stand against the unjust segregation laws. The boycott, which King believed would last only a few days, stretched to 381 days of walking to work, carpooling, and enduring harassment and violence. The city of Montgomery responded to the boycott with resistance and repression. King was arrested, his home was bombed, and he was subjected to personal abuse. However, he persisted with the principles of nonviolent resistance and persisted with the boycott. He emerged as a national figure during the boycott, attracting attention from national media and civil rights leaders across the country. The boycott's financial impact on the Montgomery city lines, the city's bus company, and the national attention on Montgomery's segregationist policies led to a legal challenge. Browder v. Gale, filed by civil rights lawyers Fred Gray and Charles D. Langford on behalf of 4 African American women who had been mistreated by the bus service, made its way through the courts. On June 5, 1956, the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama issued a ruling declaring racial segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, unconstitutional. The city of Montgomery appealed the decision, but on November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling. On December 20, 1956, the court order was served to Montgomery officials, ending the boycott the following day. The Montgomery bus boycott served as an inflection point in the U.S. civil rights movement and for King himself. It demonstrated the power of nonviolent protest, inspiring other peaceful demonstrations for racial equality. For King, it was a foundational moment that defined his leadership role in the civil rights movement and solidified his commitment to nonviolent resistance as the most potent weapon in the fight for racial justice. Chapter 3, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Building on the momentum of the successful Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders recognized the need for a sustained, strategic organization dedicated to dismantling segregation and achieving full voting rights for African Americans. Out of this need arose the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, founded in early 1957. The formation of the SCLC was a decisive moment in the civil rights movement. King, along with key figures such as Ralph Abernathy, Joseph Lory, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Bayard Rustin, established the organization to harness the moral authority and organizing power of the Black church. They envisioned the SCLC as a platform to conduct nonviolent protests aimed at reforming the nation's discriminatory laws and practices. King was chosen as the SCLC's first president, a role that formalized his position as the preeminent leader of the civil rights movement. King's principled advocacy for nonviolent protest became the SCLC's guiding strategy. Inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and American transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, the SCLC implemented civil disobedience tactics, protests that intentionally violated unjust laws, as their primary method for confronting racial injustice. The SCLC's operations often involved voter registration campaigns, protest organization, and community education about civil rights. The organization worked primarily in the South, where segregation was legally enforced and black disenfranchisement was rampant. Its methods, however, were not universally accepted. The SCLC's nonviolent approach was seen by some as overly passive, leading to tensions with other groups advocating for more radical measures. Under King's leadership, the SCLC played pivotal roles in major civil rights movement events. The organization was instrumental in the successful campaign to desegregate public facilities in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. It was also a key organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Despite facing enormous challenges, the SCLC's persistent campaigning and the tireless work of its staff and volunteers eventually led to significant victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting, can both be seen as fruition of the SCLC's labors. The creation of the SCLC, with Martin Luther King Jr. at its helm, signified the consolidation of the civil rights movement under a united front. The SCLC's strategies of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience became the movement's trademarks, ultimately changing the course of American history. The organization solidified King's status as a national leader and further amplified his voice for justice, equality, and peace. Chapter 4, I Have a Dream. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. ascended the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to address a crowd of approximately 250,000 people who had gathered for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What followed was one of the most iconic speeches in American history, the "I Have a Dream" speech, a masterstroke of rhetorical brilliance that left an indelible mark on the civil rights movement and the nation's collective consciousness. King began his speech by invoking the memory of the Emancipation Proclamation, signed by Abraham Lincoln 100 years earlier, which had heralded the end of slavery but not the end of racial injustice. He metaphorically described the promise of equality inherent in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as a promissory note on which America had defaulted for its citizens of color. King's speech then transitioned to his dream, a profoundly hopeful and visionary articulation of a future where racial harmony and equality would be realized. This part of the speech was reportedly improvised, a testament to King's remarkable oratory skills. Encouraged by gospel singer Mahalia Jackson from the crowd, who shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," King veered away from his prepared text. He dreamed of a time when the nation would rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He dreamed that his 4 children would one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. He envisioned a day when freedom and justice would be a reality for all, regardless of their race. The "I Have a Dream" section of the speech, with its hopeful, poetic, and visionary language, is what most people remember. Yet, it's essential to note that the speech was also unflinchingly honest about the brutal realities of racism, the urgency for change, and the consequences of continued inaction. King's speech at the March on Washington was a watershed moment for the civil rights movement. It catapulted King to international prominence and brought the struggle for civil rights to the forefront of the nation's consciousness like never before. His inspiring words galvanized supporters, put pressure on the Kennedy administration to advance civil rights legislation, and provided a model of peaceful protest and powerful rhetoric that continues to inspire activists worldwide. King's "I Have a Dream" speech continues to resonate today as a poignant call for racial justice and equality. The vision he painted that day of a nation overcoming its racial divide to fulfill its creed of equality for all remains one of the most enduring aspirations of American society. Chapter 5, Nobel Peace Prize. On October 14, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. was announced as the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, marking a significant recognition of his unwavering commitment to nonviolent struggle against racial discrimination in the United States. At 35 years old, King became the youngest laureate at that time, cementing his stature on the international stage. The Nobel Committee, in its announcement, highlighted King's leadership in the struggle for racial equality in America and his adherence to the Gandhian principles of nonviolence. The committee commended King's role as a unifying leader whose work contributed significantly towards a likely end to the legally codified racial segregation in America. King was in Atlanta when the announcement came. He had just returned from a grueling voter registration drive in Mississippi and was awakened early in the morning with the news. Initially believing the call to be a prank, it was only after hearing the voice of his secretary on the other end that he realized the call's authenticity. King was humble in his acceptance. He remarked that the award was not just a personal honor but a tribute to the civil rights movement, which he said was a struggle which stretches into the past well beyond the modern civil rights movement, and embraces the whole of American history. The award ceremony took place on December 10, 1964, in Oslo, Norway. In his acceptance speech, King again emphasized the collective struggle for civil rights and acknowledged that the fight was far from over. He declared that he accepted the award on behalf of all who had struggled for freedom and in the name of the civil rights movement, which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice. King's Nobel Peace Prize came at a critical juncture in the American civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act had been signed into law just a few months earlier, in July 1964, marking a significant legislative victory. Yet, King and his fellow activists were keenly aware that there was still much work to be done, particularly in areas of voting rights and economic equality. The Nobel Peace Prize amplified King's voice on an international stage, lending further legitimacy to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. His leadership and the nonviolent resistance methods of the civil rights movement inspired liberation and equality movements worldwide, demonstrating the global impact of his philosophy and tactics. King donated his prize money, approximately $54,000, to the furtherance of the civil rights cause, underscoring his commitment to the movement and his selflessness in its pursuit. His Nobel Peace Prize, therefore, was not just a personal honor but an international recognition of the justice of the struggle for civil rights and the potential of nonviolent resistance to effect meaningful change. Chapter 6, Chicago Campaign in Opposition to Vietnam War. By 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. had achieved significant victories in the American South, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Seeking to address the economic injustices suffered by African Americans in the North, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, launched the Chicago Campaign. The goal was to challenge racial discrimination in housing, employment, and educational opportunities, issues that were deeply rooted in northern cities. The Chicago campaign was King's first major initiative in a northern city, and it proved to be an immense challenge. King himself moved into a slum apartment in the west side of Chicago to highlight the squalid living conditions experienced by many African Americans in the city. The campaign conducted marches to protest housing segregation, often met with violent opposition from white residents and hardline resistance from the city's political machinery, led by Mayor Richard J. Daley. Despite these challenges, the Chicago campaign made some headway. It led to the signing of the Chicago Freedom Movement Summit Agreement, which promised improved housing conditions and an end to discrimination in real estate practices. However, the enforcement of this agreement was lackluster, and the systemic issues of urban segregation and economic inequality remained largely unaltered. The campaign marked a significant point in King's career, demonstrating the entrenched nature of racial inequality beyond the South and the enormity of the economic challenges facing African American communities. In 1967, King's activism took another pivotal turn as he publicly declared his opposition to the Vietnam War. King had harbored reservations about the war for years, considering it unjust, but had kept silent to avoid undermining the support of President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been instrumental in pushing through civil rights legislation. However, King eventually decided that his commitment to nonviolence and justice compelled him to speak out. On April 4, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York City, King gave his Beyond Vietnam speech, wherein he described the U.S. government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. King linked the struggle for social justice at home with the fight against militarism abroad, arguing that the resources poured into the war effort should be redirected toward addressing poverty in America. King's anti-war stance was highly controversial, even within the civil rights movement. Critics argued that his position would alienate the Johnson administration and other allies, while some civil rights activists felt that he was diluting the movement's focus. Despite the criticism, King stood firm in his opposition to the Vietnam War, seeing it as a moral imperative. These two chapters of King's late career, the Chicago campaign and his opposition to the Vietnam War, showcased the breadth of his activism. They underscored King's belief in an interconnected struggle against racism, economic inequality, and militarism, a belief that underpinned his evolving vision of a comprehensive civil rights agenda in the last years of his life. Chapter 7: Personal Life. Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal life, while often overshadowed by his prominent role as a civil rights leader, was marked by deep familial bonds and shared commitments to social justice, particularly with his wife, Coretta Scott King. King met Coretta Scott while he was a doctoral student at Boston University. Scott, a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, was an aspiring singer and musician. Their first meeting in early 1952 was arranged by a mutual friend, Mary Powell, who thought they would be a good match. The connection was immediate, with both King and Scott finding common ground in their Southern roots and shared commitment to social justice. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of King's doctoral studies, with letters and phone calls interspersing their meetings. These early interactions reflected not just their growing affection for each other but also their shared vision of the social and political changes they sought. By April of 1952, they were engaged. King and Scott were married on June 18, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in Heiberger, Alabama. The wedding was officiated by King's father, Martin Luther King Sr. The newlyweds moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where King had accepted a position as pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, shortly after their marriage. Over the course of their marriage, the couple had 4 children: Yolanda Denise, born 1955, Martin Luther III, born 1957, Dexter Scott, born 1961, and Bernice Albertine, born 1963. Despite the demands of his leadership in the civil rights movement, King was deeply committed to his family. His letters and writings often express his love for his children and his regret for the time his work required him to be away from them. Coretta Scott King played a crucial role in King's life and the civil rights movement. She was not merely a supportive spouse but an active participant and partner in King's activism. Her own commitment to nonviolence, justice, and equality were a cornerstone of their shared life. She helped organize and participated in marches, gave speeches, and was involved in fundraising and outreach efforts. Following King's assassination in 1968, Coretta Scott King continued her husband's legacy. She worked tirelessly to establish the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, advocating for the preservation and education of King's teachings. She was also instrumental in the campaign to make King's birthday a national holiday in the United States, a feat accomplished in 1983. She continued her advocacy for civil rights, equality, and nonviolence until her death in 2006. In the public memory, Martin Luther King Jr. is often seen as a solitary figure leading the charge for civil rights. However, his personal life paints a different picture. It reveals a man deeply committed to his family, a partnership with Coretta Scott King grounded in shared convictions and mutual support, and a legacy carried on by his children. The interplay between his public and private life provides a fuller, more nuanced portrait of King as a leader and a human being. Chapter 8: Assassination. The life of Martin Luther King Jr. came to a tragic end on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. The city was the backdrop of a tense struggle for economic equality, as over 1,000 of its sanitation workers, most of them African American, had gone on strike. King had traveled to Memphis to lend his support to the striking workers, highlighting his growing emphasis on economic justice within the broader civil rights movement. King and his companions were staying at the Lorraine Motel, a well-known establishment in the African American community. At 6:01 p.m., as King stood on the second-floor balcony, a bullet struck him in the face. Rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, he was pronounced dead within an hour. King was 39 years old. News of King's assassination sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. A beacon of nonviolent resistance and a symbol of the fight for racial equality, King's death was felt as a profound loss. The shock soon gave way to anger and grief, especially within the African American community. Riots broke out in over 100 cities across the United States. The civil unrest reflected a profound sense of despair and frustration at the assassination of the nation's most prominent civil rights leader. It was one of the most widespread waves of social unrest the country had seen, underscoring the depth of the nation's racial tensions and the significant role King had played in addressing them. At the same time, peaceful memorials and vigils were also held. Thousands gathered to mourn King's passing and to commemorate his life. His funeral, held on April 9 in Atlanta, drew notable figures from around the world, including Vice President Hubert Humphrey representing the U.S. government. King's coffin was carried by a mule-drawn wagon, a symbol of the Poor People's Campaign he had been organizing at the time of his death. The investigation into King's assassination led to the arrest of James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal who had escaped from prison in 1967. Ray confessed to the killing in March 1969, although he recanted his confession 3 days later. Despite this, he was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison. He died in 1998. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. marked a significant moment in American history. It was not only the loss of a key figure in the struggle for racial equality but also a catalyst for deeper societal introspection about race relations and civil rights in the United States. The repercussions of King's death continue to be felt, and his life and legacy remain influential in ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Chapter 9: Legacy. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is woven deeply into the fabric of American society and beyond. His impact extends far beyond his roles as a leader of the civil rights movement and a proponent of nonviolent resistance. King's contributions to social justice, his philosophies, and his teachings continue to shape movements for equality and human rights globally. One of the most tangible recognitions of King's legacy is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday observed on the third Monday in January each year. The establishment of this holiday was not without contention. Despite initial legislation being introduced shortly after King's assassination in 1968, it was not until 1983 that President Ronald Reagan signed the holiday into law, and all 50 states did not formally observe the holiday until the year 2000. Each year, the day serves as a moment of reflection on King's ideals and a call to service, reflecting one of King's famous statements: "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" King's influence is also physically present in the numerous streets, schools, and buildings named in his honor across the United States and around the world. There are over 900 streets named after King in the U.S. alone. Each of these places serves as a reminder of his lasting impact and a testament to the values he embodied. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. is another tribute to his legacy. Open to the public in 2011, the memorial features a 30-foot-tall statue of King and inscriptions of excerpts from his speeches, sermons, and writings. It's a place of reflection and inspiration, embodying the peace and equality that King dedicated his life to achieving. But perhaps King's most enduring legacy is the profound influence his philosophies continue to exert on social and political movements. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance remains a crucial strategy for groups advocating for civil rights and social change. The principles he championed, of equality, justice, and the intrinsic dignity of all people, continue to fuel movements for social justice, from racial and economic equality to LGBTQ+ rights and climate justice. His words and teachings are frequently invoked as calls to action and reminders of the continuous struggle for justice. King's legacy also continues through the work of the institutions he and his wife, Coretta Scott King, founded. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, continues its advocacy work, focusing on issues such as voting rights, economic justice, and education. The King Center in Atlanta, established by Coretta Scott King, serves to promote his nonviolent philosophies and techniques as solutions to social, political, and economic conflict around the world. In a broader sense, King's life and work have come to symbolize the potential for individual and collective action to effect significant social change. His legacy stands as a testament to the enduring power of peaceful protest and the pursuit of justice, and it continues to inspire new generations in their struggles for equality and civil rights. His life's work serves as a reminder of the journey toward justice and the work that remains to be done. More information and facts. Part 1, Extended Family Influences. Martin Luther King Jr.'s extended family, particularly the lineage of pastors and preachers from which he hailed, played a significant role in molding his philosophical worldview and instilling the values he would come to champion throughout his life. Indeed, King's upbringing in a household deeply ingrained in the traditions of the Black church and its attendant social and spiritual concerns would mark the genesis of his journey as a civil rights leader and a beacon of moral conscience for the nation. King's paternal grandfather, the Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, was a crucial figure in this lineage. Williams was the pastor of Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, a role he assumed in 1894. He was a prominent figure in Atlanta's African American community and a respected leader who utilized the pulpit not only for spiritual guidance but also to champion civil rights. Williams was the founder of the Atlanta chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and regularly advocated for equal rights and against racial injustice from the pulpit. The values he stood for deeply influenced his daughter Alberta, who would become the mother of Martin Luther King Jr. Williams' son-in-law. Martin Luther King Sr., took over his father-in-law's pastorship in 1931. Known as Daddy King, he inherited the mantle of social activism along with the pulpit. Under his stewardship, Ebenezer Baptist Church grew in stature as a center for Atlanta's African American community and a hub for social change. King Sr. was not just a religious leader, he was a civic leader who spoke forcefully against racial discrimination and segregation and played a significant role in the struggle for voting rights for African Americans in Georgia. The strong ethical and moral principles of King's father and grandfather, coupled with their active involvement in social justice, greatly shaped King's understanding of the Christian faith as an active force for societal transformation. His familial environment inculcated in him a belief system that tied spiritual redemption to social justice and taught him that religious faith was meaningless unless it was lived out in the service of others and the pursuit of justice. It was within this familial and religious context that King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and his commitment to racial and economic justice took root. Moreover, King's mother, Alberta Williams King, played an equally influential role in his moral and intellectual development. An educated woman and a talented musician, she instilled in King a love for learning and a strong moral compass. She imbued him with a sense of self-respect and self-worth that would later help him resist the dehumanizing effects of segregation and racism. She also instilled in him a deep sense of faith and a belief in the power of love and nonviolence. Thus, King's family provided a nurturing environment where he was steeped in a religious tradition that combined faith with social activism. His family's influence created a foundation for his own leadership in the civil rights movement, grounded in the belief that religious faith was a driving force for social change and the attainment of justice. Part 2, Religious Influences. Throughout his formative years and later as he matured into a civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr.'s religious influences were multifaceted, stemming from a broad spectrum of Christian theologians, ethicists, and philosophers, in addition to several prominent figures outside of Christian tradition. These influences played a critical role in shaping King's conception of nonviolent resistance and social justice, principles that guided his approach to the civil rights movement. One of the significant influences on King's theological understanding was his encounter with the works of liberal Protestant theologians while he was a student at Morehouse College and later, at Crozer Theological Seminary and Boston University. Among these theologians were Walter Rauschenbusch, whose work on the social gospel underscored the Christian duty to address social inequities, and Reinhold Niebuhr, whose Christian realism cautioned against the naivety of believing in humanity's unaided capacity for moral progress. These influences shaped King's understanding of Christian ethics and social responsibility, infusing him with a sense of urgency to combat societal injustices. King was also profoundly influenced by the personalist philosophy he encountered at Boston University. Personalism is a school of thought emphasizing the inherent value and dignity of the individual. This philosophy aligned with and further developed King's inherent belief in the sacred worth of all individuals, a principle he frequently espoused during his involvement in the civil rights movement. However, arguably the most influential figure in shaping King's philosophical approach to civil rights activism was Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi. King first learned of Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, or satyagraha, during his time at Crozer. He was deeply moved by Gandhi's successful use of nonviolent civil disobedience in achieving India's independence from British rule. Gandhi's teaching, nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man, resonated with King's Christian ethics and his commitment to nonviolence. In 1959, King visited India, where he had the opportunity to deepen his understanding of Gandhian principles. He saw satyagraha not merely as a tactic but as a way of life, an underpinning philosophy that must permeate all aspects of one's life and community. King once said, "Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method." This synthesis of Christian love and Gandhian nonviolent resistance would be seen in the successful Montgomery bus boycott, which was carried out without recourse to violence despite facing severe repression. In all, these religious influences shaped King's intellectual development and gave him a theological basis for his civil rights activism. They shaped his perception of social justice, imbued in him a firm commitment to nonviolence, and equipped him with the moral courage to confront the systemic injustices African Americans faced in the United States. Part 3, Detailed Examination of Major Works. Martin Luther King Jr. was not only a profound speaker but also an eloquent writer. His written works provided intellectual and moral frameworks for the civil rights movement and continue to shape our understanding of race, democracy, and human dignity. His major works include Stride Toward Freedom, 1958, The Measure of a Man, 1959, Letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963, and Why We Can't Wait, 1964. Stride Toward Freedom is King's first book, an account of the Montgomery bus boycott, where King first served as the public face of the civil rights movement. In the book, King provided a detailed narrative of the boycott, offering readers a view of the practical and philosophical underpinnings of the nonviolent resistance that was to become the trademark of the movement. This work also introduced readers to the philosophy of nonviolence, showcasing King's synthesis of Christian and Gandhian ideals. Here, King established nonviolent resistance not just as a political strategy but as a moral imperative to fight against injustice. The Measure of a Man is a slim volume that elucidates King's philosophical and theological beliefs. This book is based on sermons King delivered, and it explores fundamental questions about the nature of man, ethics, and the just society. The work reflects King's belief in the inherent dignity and worth of each individual and the interconnectedness of all people. It also reiterates the importance of love and nonviolence as central tenets of his philosophy. In 1963, while incarcerated in Birmingham, Alabama, for participating in nonviolent protests against segregation, King penned his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. This open letter, addressed to 8 white clergymen who had criticized the Birmingham protests as unwise and untimely, is perhaps one of the most important documents of the civil rights movement. In this letter, King articulates his philosophy of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, making a powerful argument that individuals have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws. He argued for the urgency of civil rights reforms, declaring, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Why We Can't Wait was written in 1964, following the momentous events of the previous year, which included the Birmingham Campaign, the March on Washington, and King's I Have a Dream speech. The book is a historical analysis of the events leading up to 1963, arguing that African Americans could no longer wait for gradual change. It examines the deep-rooted racism in American society and the urgent need for civil rights reforms. King also presents his vision of a society where equality, justice, and freedom are not merely slogans but lived realities for all citizens. These major works by King not only shed light on the historical and socio-political context of the civil rights movement but also continued to provide profound insights into the struggle for racial equality and the moral imperative of nonviolent resistance. They affirmed King's position as a thinker of remarkable depth and moral courage, committed to dismantling systems of oppression through love and nonviolent resistance. His writings remain a powerful call for justice and equality, and their influence is evident in social and racial justice movements to this day. Part 4: Controversies and Criticisms. Martin Luther King Jr., despite his profound impact on American society and his celebrated legacy, was not without his share of controversies and criticisms, which came from multiple fronts. This included critiques from more radical civil rights activists, as well as opposition to his stance on the Vietnam War. Prominent among King's critics were more radical activists such as Malcolm X and members of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X, a minister and human rights activist, criticized King's nonviolent approach as being too passive and ineffective against the systemic and entrenched nature of American racism. While King championed racial integration and harmony, Malcolm X, at least for the majority of his career, promoted a more separatist ideology, arguing that black people needed to secure their rights and improve their conditions by themselves, independently of white society. The Black Power movement, which emerged in the mid-1960s, also took issue with King's nonviolent approach. Figures like Stokely Carmichael, who coined the term Black Power, argued for a more militant and assertive approach to securing civil rights, one that was prepared to use violence if necessary. They criticized King's vision of integration as being too conciliatory towards white people and not enough about empowering black people. Furthermore, King faced considerable controversy and criticism for his public opposition to the Vietnam War, which he expressed most forcefully in his 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam. Many white liberals, who had previously supported King's civil rights efforts, viewed his anti-war stance as a betrayal, arguing that it complicated their political efforts to support the civil rights agenda in Congress. Even some civil rights activists felt that King's outspokenness on Vietnam diverted attention away from domestic civil rights issues. King's opposition to the war was based on his deep-seated belief in nonviolence and his conviction that the struggle for civil rights in America was inseparably connected to global issues of war and peace. He saw the war as an extension of the same injustice that the civil rights movement was fighting against at home, stating, "I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." King's critiques and controversies underscore the complexity of his position within the civil rights movement and the broader political landscape of the time. While his commitment to nonviolence and his stance against the Vietnam War have been validated by history, they were, in their time, positions that aroused significant debate and discord. Understanding this context is critical for a holistic view of King's life and legacy. Part 5: Assassination Conspiracy Theories. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination on April 4, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, shocked the nation and the world. While James Earl Ray was arrested and confessed to the assassination, later recanting his confession, numerous conspiracy theories have emerged in the decades since that suggest a broader and more complex plot behind King's death. From the onset, doubts were cast on the official narrative that James Earl Ray, a petty criminal and prison escapee, acted alone. These doubts were fueled by Ray's inconsistent accounts and his later insistence that he was innocent. He claimed that he had been set up by a man named Raoul, who he said was involved in the plot to kill King. However, despite multiple investigations, no one matching Ray's description of Raoul was ever found, and Ray was not able to provide evidence to substantiate his claims. One of the most enduring conspiracy theories suggests that the U.S. government, and specifically the FBI, was involved in the assassination. Under Director J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI had been conducting an extensive surveillance program against King, known as COINTELPRO. The program aimed to undermine King's reputation in the civil rights movement. This documented hostility towards King led some to suspect that the FBI had a hand in his assassination. The idea of government involvement gained further traction in 1999 when the King family brought a civil suit, King Family vs. Jowers and other unknown co-conspirators, to trial. Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis bar owner, had publicly stated that he was part of a conspiracy to kill King, involving the Mafia and the U.S. government. While the details of Jowers' account changed over time, the jury in the civil trial found that Jowers and others, including governmental agencies, were complicit in King's assassination. However, this verdict is controversial, with many historians and legal experts raising questions about the evidence presented in the trial. Another theory implicates the Mafia in King's assassination. This theory suggests that the Mafia ordered the hit on King in response to his and the SCLC's efforts to involve themselves in the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, which was a business heavily influenced by the Mafia. While these theories persist, none have been definitively proven. The U.S. government conducted multiple investigations into King's assassination, the latest being the Department of Justice's 2000 investigation, which found no reliable evidence to support the conspiracy theories. These theories, however, highlight the intense societal and governmental pressures that King was under during his life. They speak to the contentious relationship between King and institutional powers, and the broader climate of fear, mistrust, and resistance that characterized the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America. Whether any of these theories hold truth remains one of history's unresolved questions. Despite the uncertainty surrounding his death, what is undeniable is King's profound and lasting impact on the struggle for racial equality and his enduring legacy as a symbol of nonviolent resistance against oppression. Part 6: King's International Impact. Martin Luther King Jr.'s impact and influence cannot be confined merely to the borders of the United States. His legacy of nonviolent resistance, his captivating oratory, and his moral leadership in the struggle for civil rights and social justice had profound effects that echoed across the globe. King's principles and strategies have been adopted by various movements around the world, from the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to the peace process in Northern Ireland and beyond. The anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa is one significant example of King's international impact. Many anti-apartheid activists were inspired by King's nonviolent approach to civil rights, and they adapted his principles to their struggle against South Africa's brutal racial segregation system. King himself was vocal in his opposition to apartheid, describing it as a modern form of slavery and an affront to human dignity. His advocacy for economic sanctions against the apartheid regime was a significant influence on international policy towards South Africa. In Northern Ireland, King's teachings influenced the peace process, specifically the nonviolent strategies employed to end decades of sectarian violence. John Hume, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, often referenced King's methods and speeches in his pursuit of peace and justice in Northern Ireland. He cited King's emphasis on nonviolence and reconciliation as critical components of the peace process that culminated in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. King's influence also reached into the civil rights movements in other countries, inspiring activists in places as diverse as Australia, India, and Israel. For example, the Aboriginal rights movement in Australia, which gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s, drew inspiration from the American civil rights movement and King's nonviolent philosophy. Similarly, Dalit activists in India have employed King's strategies in their struggle against caste discrimination. King's global influence extends even into the realms of academia and cultural expression, where his speeches and writings continue to be studied for their rich insight into justice, nonviolence, and human dignity. His legacy has also been immortalized in monuments around the world, from the statue of him in Westminster Abbey in London, to streets named after him in numerous countries, reflecting his worldwide significance. Overall, King's international impact reaffirms his position as a global icon for social justice. The principles he championed, nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and the interconnectedness of all people, transcend national and cultural boundaries. His life and teachings serve as a blueprint for those who seek to confront injustice and strive for a more equitable and compassionate world. Part 7. Continuing influence of his family. The influence of Martin Luther King Jr.'s family extends beyond his own remarkable life and continues to be felt in the ongoing struggle for social justice and civil rights. King's immediate family, particularly his wife, Coretta Scott King, and his 4 children, have dedicated their lives to perpetuating his legacy and advocating for the causes he held dear. Coretta Scott King, who King once referred to as his courage and determination, was an influential civil rights activist in her own right. Beyond her vital support role during King's lifetime, following his assassination, she committed herself to immortalizing King's philosophies and achievements. She established the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, serving as the center's president and chief executive officer. She was instrumental in the campaign to recognize King's birthday as a national holiday, a goal realized in 1986. Coretta continued her activism for numerous causes including women's rights, LGBT rights, and world peace until her death in 2006. King's eldest daughter, Yolanda King, carried on her father's message through her career as an actress and speaker, using her platform to advocate for equality and nonviolence. Martin Luther King III, the second child, has worked in roles including president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and co-founder of Bounce TV, using these positions to address issues of social justice. He has been an outspoken advocate against police brutality and racial profiling. The younger son, Dexter Scott King, assumed the presidency of the King Center after his mother's death, where he works to further his father's legacy. He has also worked as a documentary filmmaker, exploring subjects related to his father's life and work. The youngest child, Bernice King, a minister like her father, has also served as CEO of the King Center. She has been involved in numerous initiatives to promote nonviolent social change, and she frequently speaks on issues of race and justice. The legacy of the King family extends beyond the immediate family, with King's extended family members often involved in social justice issues. His sister, Christine King Ferris, is an educator who has written several books about her brother and their family, and his niece, Alveda King, is a prominent conservative activist and commentator. In continuing to advocate for the principles Martin Luther King Jr. espoused, his family has ensured that his legacy remains at the forefront of discussions about civil rights and social justice. Their contributions highlight the ongoing relevance of King's vision for a more equitable society and underscore the fact that the struggle for civil rights is a continuous endeavor passed from one generation to the next. Part 8. Contemporary relevance. The legacy and teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. remain profoundly relevant in contemporary struggles for social justice, particularly in the United States. His philosophy of nonviolent protest, his commitment to equality, and his vision of a society where people are judged by their character rather than the color of their skin, continue to inspire and inform modern-day movements, most notably Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, which gained significant momentum following the 2013 acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer and rose to further prominence after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, echoes King's struggle for racial equality. The movement's emphasis on peaceful protest and its commitment to revealing systemic racism resonate with King's principles. The rallying cry that Black Lives Matter aligns with King's own assertions of the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, regardless of their race. While BLM's methods sometimes diverge from King's, embracing direct action and confrontation more readily, its ultimate goal of achieving racial justice and its focus on mobilizing communities align closely with King's vision. His ideas are often invoked in speeches and writings by BLM activists, and his life serves as a testament to the transformative power of collective, peaceful action. Beyond the BLM movement, King's teachings have relevance in other ongoing debates on racial and social justice. His advocacy for economic equality, for example, finds resonance in discussions about wealth disparity and the need for improved social safety nets. His call for voting rights is echoed in contemporary battles over voter suppression. His insistence on the interconnectedness of all people informs debates on immigration policy. Furthermore, his belief in nonviolence as a strategy for social change remains influential in peace and disarmament campaigns. The application of his philosophy in these various contexts underscores the breadth of King's vision and its continued relevance in the 21st century. As we trace the arc of King's influence from the past into the present, it becomes clear that his life and teachings continue to reverberate in our collective struggle for a more just and equitable society. Whether in the streets of cities across America where Black Lives Matter protesters march, or in the words of those advocating for economic justice, voting rights, or peace, King's legacy lives on. It is testament to the enduring power of his dream of a society where all people are treated with dignity and respect. His is a legacy that continues to challenge and inspire, serving as a beacon in the ongoing fight for social justice and equality. Thanks for watching to the end. See you in new videos.